support for undocumented immigrant college students that so many of us who are in higher education spent the last decade or so creating were tested to their limits. But for the most part, the networks of allies and supporters we built, the system of services and information we had been laboriously constructing one at a time, held up. While COVID, and I'm going to get into this a little bit, made it hard to provide our students with the support they needed, there were many of us across the country working precisely on this question, seeking to elevate this issue to where it needed to be addressed. We were definitely tested, and there were those out there who are still intent on targeting our communities, immigrant or not, and in testing us further. However, I am here today to tell you why I have hope and why I believe that if we continue down the path like the kind that you're building here today in this course that you're doing, I believe there are better times ahead for us. But before I can explain that, I want to tell you a little bit about my life and how I became aware of the significance of the role that my undocumentedness played in my life. And to that, I need to tell you the tale of young Beto, the hyper-documented Vato Loco. So indeed, the existential questions about the nature of my undocumentedness consumed me when I was young, during those first 10 years of being in the US. So I arrived as an undocumented immigrant kid to the US in 1974. And from 1974 to about 1984, I grew up without really thinking much about what it meant to be undocumented. I saw that we were poor. We lived in a poor part of the U.S. in East Oakland. My dad worked in a factory, in a piston foundry. He did okay. He went from job to job now and then, but he seemed to provide for us okay. And so being undocumented, while we seemed to struggle, the struggle was similar to what we had struggled in Mexico. And so I really didn't think much about the nature of my undocumentedness during those first years. My parents, they insisted that my sisters and I had to be good and obedient kids. They asked us to get good grades at school, and they took us to church each Sunday where we had to follow the gospel, and they told us not to misbehave. And yet at home, they told us that we were ilegales, indocumentados. And yet that was something that they really didn't want to talk about too much. I think that the first time I really began to analyze what my undocumentedness meant happened 10 years after we arrived, when I was in high school. It happened when I met a girl. And so let me tell you about that. So I went to middle school in East Oakland. There were only about 4 or 5 Latino students in middle school, in a middle school of about 800 students. And so, I stood out pretty clearly. When I went to high school, however, close to half of the high school was Latino students. And so when I got there, I wanted to pretend like I was a citizen, because I knew that I was undocumented, and I wanted to give the impression that I was not. And so for me, the students that seemed to be the citizens at Fremont High in East Oakland were the students who were in the barrio gangs, the students who dressed like Vato Locos, the ones who were dressed like they were in street gangs. And so here I am, walking from home, wearing these really long shirts with khaki pants, combing my hair back, dressed like I was in a gang, but I wasn't. And yet at the same time, because of my dad, saying that I had to behave, that I had to follow the rules, I was very studious. And so I must have looked really odd to my teachers and my friends when I would, dress like I was not following the rules, and yet at the same time, I was being very studious. I caught the attention of my teachers because I did that. They thought I was odd because of the way I looked. And yet at the same time, they saw that I, read novels all the time, that I, seemed to, do good in math, and that I did my homework. And so one day, my teacher brought me in and said, "Hey, if you're doing that, you might, be thinking about college. But if you're going to go to college, you have to prepare yourself, and that means doing extracurricular work. And to do that, the only thing that's available here at Fremont is to be part of student government. And so why don't you think about joining student government?" I don't know if any of you here have been part of student government, but for me at Fremont High, I didn't know what that meant. My parents had no idea what that meant. They're like, "Student government, what the heck is that?" And I'm like, "Well, it means that I have to go in earlier to school." And my dad was like, "Well, it doesn't bother me. Just take the bus earlier. You go to school, right?" And I'm like, "Okay, So I just got up like an hour earlier and went to school. And I actually became the secretary for our senior class. Now, don't be impressed, because I ran unopposed. Nobody ran against me. And so I became the secretary for our senior class because nobody else wanted to do it. And so, here I was for about a month, every day getting up at 6 a.m., going to Fremont High, because the secretary had to take notes at every meeting. And then if the president met with the principal and there was any business discussed with the principal, or anything that, the student government needed to be a part of, the secretary had to be there to report back. And so I had to be there. I had to type everything up. So, it was like a lot of work, right? I had to do a lot of that, but I did everything, because my teacher said that I should do it. And then I found out one day, our teacher told us that the student body president was going to resign because his parents owned a restaurant and they wanted him to work at the restaurant. And so the student body, our teacher in the government class said, "Well, now somebody needs to become the new student body president. Do we have a volunteer?" Nobody else wanted to do it. And I actually thought, well, that's actually less work than what I'm doing right now. Can I do that? And the teacher said, "Sure." So I became student body president. Later that day, when I volunteered, the principal said my name on the loudspeakers. And Fremont High is a big high school. So we had about 3,000 students. And all 3,000 students heard over the loudspeakers, "Alberto Ledesma is the new student body president." And here you have all my friends like teasing me. "Oh, now you think you're a big deal, right?" Like, "Ooh," And so they teased me for a few days, And so I went home. My parents were like, "What does that mean?" Excuse me. I apologize. I have asthma, so I have to catch my breath a little bit here. So I had to explain to my parents that there was really no difference. And, I just still had to go to A period. I had to organize dances. I had to raise funds. That's all. But there was no more work. And so for them, there was no difference. Like, okay, whatever, we don't care. And about a few days later, there was a phone call that came to the house. And, my dad, so we lived in a house in East Oakland that my mom called La Tripa. I don't know if you guys if you know what that means. It means the tripe, or the long intestine, kind of, and what she meant is that our rooms were like staggered one after the other. And so the living room was like in the front of the house. And, it's a very thin house, very tight, very narrow. And my room was actually the very back of the house. And so one day, when we get this phone call, and the phone was located in the front of the house. And I hear my dad's loud, "Alberto, you have a phone call," from the front of the house, like, kind of shaking the whole house. I never got phone calls. Never ever. And not that I was, that popular. Just at that time, think about it. This is back in the 80s, it's before Facebook, before any of that social media, right? We didn't have cell phones or anything like that. I never got phone calls. Now, the only person who got phone calls was my dad. He got phone calls from Mexico from his brothers and sisters. So he always sat next to the phone waiting for his brothers and sisters to call him. And so he protected that phone. If anybody called, he's like, that's who called him. And so if anybody used the phone, he's like, you better put it down. My brothers and sisters are going to call. And so I got this phone call. The first thing he tells me when I went to pick it up is like, okay, make it a hurry because I'm about to get a phone call from my brother or sister. And so I pick up the phone. Now, who's calling me? And I hear this sexy voice. And it goes, Alberto, I heard you just became student body president. And I'm like, what? Who is this? And it's like, yeah, that is cool. And I'm, yeah. Like, who is this? I'm trying to figure it out. Like, who the heck is calling me? I don't know. And she's like, yeah, that is so cool. I've seen you in high school reading your book. I'm like, wow, who is this? I'm trying to figure it out. What's happening here? And she's like, that is so cool. You seem to be, going places. I'm like, what? Like, what? I thought, this must be a scam or something. What's happening here? And I'm thinking, I couldn't recognize the person. And she spoke a little bit more. And then my dad started going, my brother or sister is going to call me. You better put that phone down. I'm like, who is this? And she goes, don't you recognize me? I'm like, I have no idea who it is. And then it hits me. It's Rosa Eugenia Flores. It's the prettiest girl at school. And I'm like, why is she calling me? And it hits me. The first thing I thought about was, I think I know what's happening. My friends in fourth period gym saw how big my head got when I became student body president. And so they're playing a practical joke on me right now. They got her to call me because they're going to do some kind of practical joke. And then the next thing she says is, do you want to hang out? And I'm like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. What do I say? I'm like, what do I do? And my dad is like, my brother says it's going to call. You better hang up. And so I'm like, oh, whatever. Sure. Let's hang out, whatever. And, so at that time, I used to actually work in a restaurant. I used to work in a place called Chuck Burgers as a busboy. And so every weekend, I would have about $20 to $25 in quarters in my pocket because I was a good busboy. I would walk around everywhere sounding like jingle bells because that's what it sounded, like my pants pockets were full of quarters. And this is back in the 80s. So I don't know if you remember that they used to have a lot of like arcades, so you can go like to all these video arcades. I was really popular at arcades because I would walk in and I would have like this bags, handfuls of quarters. And, I could be there hours and have a lot of fun. And so here she was joining me. And we would go to the arcades, we went to the movies, we went to eat, and we had a lot of fun for like, months. We did this for months. And after a while, I realized, oh, my friends didn't put her up for it. She was actually interested in me. And we started talking, and it was like, wow, this was fun, right? And things seemed to be going okay. Then one day she asked me, she said, hey, Alberto, can you do me a favor? I know that you can borrow your dad's station wagon now and then because we used it sometimes to go on our dates on the weekend. Can you borrow it to give a ride to me, my sister, and my mom to the San Francisco airport because we need to go to Mexico on an emergency basis for a couple of weeks. Can you borrow it? That would really do us a favor. None of my other relatives can take us because it's a midnight flight. Can you take us? And of course, I would do anything that she would ask because, by that point, I was like, it wasn't a joke. It was cool. And so I was like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And sure enough, on the day that she wanted to leave, it came. I went to her house. And one thing that struck me when I arrived, she had a lot more luggage for the 2 weeks that she was going to be gone than I thought she should have. It was a lot of luggage. But hey, I didn't care. I, you know, I tried to impress her and her mom. I put the luggage like really neatly into the station wagon. I opened the door. I thought it was odd that she and her mom got into the back seat and her sister got in the front seat. But, I didn't judge. I'm like, okay, whatever. I try to be like the best Uber driver you ever had, where I wanted to be like really attentive. I drove like really smoothly, watching the mirror. I try to like avoid every pothole. I try to like, just stay in the middle of the lane, not go too fast or too slow. Just like I wanted to get like the perfect rating, right? But as we were driving and going to the airport, because it was getting dark, it was a midnight flight, I heard her and her mom whispering to each other in the back seat. And then I heard sobs. And they were saying things like consulate and papers. And, they were worried. And so we got to the airport. And when we got there, they were in a hurry because even though they had their tickets, the plane was about to take off. Now, at that point, this is before the airports got so militarized that you have to wait hours and hours and hours before you get on the flight. You can actually get almost to the plane at that time. It wasn't as militarized as it is now. And so I, took her almost to the plane. And before she got on the plane, I said, look, don't stop. Rosa Eugenia, let me tell you, I think I know what's going on. I stopped her. I think I know what's going on. Don't worry. If it's because you're undocumented, don't worry. I'm undocumented too. I got you. We'll get through this together, I told her. Now, I'm in high school at this point, right? I'm all idealistic. I'm like, I'm all, kind of hopeful, all this stuff. But I noticed that in her face, her expression changed. She went, she was like surprised. I don't know, she seemed to change. She turned around, got on the plane and left. And I thought maybe it was because she was late. But then she was gone, and she was gone for more than 2 weeks. She was gone for a month, then 2 months, then 3 months, then 4 months. And I thought she was never coming back. Now, my high school counselor, at that time, he actually submitted my application to college without me knowing it. And I got into the university, and she hadn't arrived yet. So I was already at Berkeley as an undocumented student, and she hadn't arrived. But I was still waiting, and I was like, what happened? I was like intrigued. Something must have happened. And, it was a mystery to me. And I wanted to know. Before she left, and I'm about to finish this part of the story. Before she left, she told me that she had a cousin in Oakland by the last name of Diaz. So I got the phone book. Do you know how many Diaz's there are in Oakland? There's hell of them. And I called every one of them. They were very upset. But I got to the cousin. And, all of them were like, what? What the heck? They were all surprised. Imagine a telemarketer, right? It's like, oh man, But I finally got to the cousin. And the cousin went, yeah, I know, I recognize you. They're like, hey, don't you know? She's been back for like more than a month now. Imagine my little heart falling out of my chest, falling down to my toes, rolling out of my toes and down the street. Because I didn't know what had happened. It's like, what happened? And then she says, her cousin told me, she goes, well, she's a gardener. So every Saturday she's outside in her garden. If you drove by, in the morning, you could see her there. And so I did that. And as I drove by in my parents' station wagon, she saw me and she waved at me and she said she wanted to talk. And so she came by. And as I was in the station wagon, she said, I should have told you, I'm sorry. But when you told me you were undocumented, I knew it wouldn't work. because I was undocumented too. And the reason I had asked you to, if we could be together, was in case things didn't work out in Mexico. And so when you say you were undocumented, I knew you were as screwed up as I was. And so things were not going to work out. In that moment, I realized that we had both been wearing disguises. I had been wearing the disguise of the vato loco most likely to succeed. That undocumented, hyper documented vato loco. But she had also been wearing a disguise. It was like an undocumented telenovela that we were playing for each other. And we really didn't know each other. And so for me, that's when this undocumented epistemology, that question, that began to emerge as something that I was curious about, something that I wanted to study. Because I knew that we really didn't know each other, because we had to project something different, towards each other. So actually, again, if you had told me back in 1974 that I would eventually become a college student, a professor, and a college administrator, I would not have believed you. Back then, I had no idea what going to college was. To me, the main thing that we were trying to do was just survive in East Oakland. Here's where we lived, in 82nd Avenue, at the end, on a dead-end street. Thankfully, in 1986, my family and I were able to legalize our status through the amnesty program signed by Ronald Reagan. And while we were now, quote, legal and supposedly had permission to work and go to school, that tentativeness and suspicion that resulted from those 12 years of conditioning did not disappear. I have often wondered why we haven't heard more stories about what it meant to live as undocumented immigrants in the United States in the 1980s. After all, as with my family, more than 3 million people from throughout Latin America and the world normalized their status during those years. A large number of these newly amnestied immigrants, almost 40%, also went on to become citizens. Why is it then that we have not heard more of the stories and their experiences? Of course, what I've also come to understand after many years of reading and doing research is that though amnesty made it easy for a generation of undocumented immigrants to come out of the shadows, it did not remove the cultural taboo that still exists in our communities regarding this experience. To be sure, after amnesty, I thrived as a college student. Without the specter of possible deportation, I felt that there were no limits to what I could do. Recently, I've learned that this desire to show that we're more than what our legal status is, drives many undocumented students to excel academically, to become hyper-documented, as Professor Aurora Chang puts it. It is from this process that the dreamer archetype has emerged. And while I have serious concerns about the ways that this archetype affects all undocumented immigrants, I don't think that we have enough time here to cover it today. After amnesty, and because of my hyperdocumented anxiety, I pursued a doctoral degree in which I studied the representation of undocumented immigrants in Mexican narratives. What I discovered was that during my studies was that even in Mexican American fiction, there was a hierarchy of immigration status where usually undocumented subjects were only discussed implicitly in Chicano stories in code as part of the background and not as protagonists. That apparent taboo around publicly discussing undocumented experience always mystified me, because I strongly believed that being undocumented was a kind of American experience. In fact, when I was a young professor, I tried to write about it in critical essays, personal story, and poetry, because I wanted to initiate a public dialogue about what it meant to be undocumented in our American society. Several of my colleagues expressed curiosity about the research I was doing. but the field of undocumented American studies was still in its nascent stage, not as developed as it's becoming today. The truth is that I became impatient because nothing I did seemed to work. I had waited for those 3 million others who went through the normalization process with me. For the most part, I heard silence. I had waited because I needed these people. I needed a sense of community that comes when you know that others have gone through the same kind of trauma you've gone through. For me, dealing with being undocumented was a difficult thing to do on my own. I feel guilty, sometimes angry at my parents and upset, but I kept it all in. It was a solitary experience, an ordeal that I couldn't really talk about, even within my own family. So what happens to these stories? What happens to all these tragic, heroic, and sometimes funny accounts? Didn't amnesty mean that we were now free to talk about these experiences? Now, when my daughter Sophia was born, I took on a different job. I left my job in academia and I became a staff member at Berkeley. And one of the nice things about that was that I actually ended up teaching summer bridge courses at Berkeley. One of the best things about teaching in summer bridge was that I taught entering students who were coming directly from high school. So it happened about a dozen years ago that I was teaching a summer bridge Mexican American history course, that my infatuation with provoking this dialogue around undocumented immigrant experience, it emerged again. At that time, we only had a couple of weeks left in class, but important things were going on around the country around the DREAM Act. It was again being debated by Congress, and unprecedented activism by undocumented immigrant students was emerging everywhere to support it. Now, there's one problem when you've been a hyper-documented student and you become a professor. Can you guess what that is? Because when you're a hyper-documented student, you tend to earn degree after degree. You tend to overcompensate. And when you become a professor, you assign too much work to your students to do. So sometimes your students then can hate you because you become the professor that works them the most, right? And so that's what happened to me. Sometimes I would teach a class, and while my friends in the history class might be teaching them in the summer, they might be assigned, let's say, 3 books that summer. I would assign my students 6 books. And my students were like, Dr. Ledesma, we're learning a lot of things and we're loving it, but it's a lot of work. And they would give me evaluations. And sometimes they would draw on the evaluation. They would draw my face on a stick, like my head on a pike. It's like, if you assign us one more thing, that's what's going to happen to you, right? And I'm like, and so when that stuff happening, when there was this undocumented immigrant activism, and I thought, wait a minute, I want to talk about this. I want to teach them about this. But how can I do this without assigning them more work? How will I do this? I was stumped. I didn't know how to do it. So one day, as my students took their last midterm before the final that summer, I tried to grapple with that question. And so I took an extra piece of paper, actually a copy of the prompt for their midterm. And on the back of that sheet, I started sketching a cartoon. And I sketched on the back of that sheet, do you know what happens in the day of a life of a DREAM Act student? Because I just wanted them to consider that question. Why can't I just doodle that to introduce the topic? And as I sketched, I noticed that they would walk up as they were turning in their midterm. I noticed how a lot of the students would linger about. And they actually wanted to see what I was drawing. They got curious. And as they got more curious, I went, hey, wait a minute. I got a little manipulative. I said, wait a minute. They don't want me to assign them more work, but what if I take this cartoon, I finish it, and maybe I use one of my PowerPoints and I just project it and I just say, what do you think about it? What if I did that, right? And so this is what I did. And so I did this cartoon and I shared it with them. And sure enough, next thing you know, a couple of the students in the class got so excited about this topic that they started doing research on their own, and they came back the next class session and they started talking about what was happening nationally, and they started connecting it to the topics in class. I didn't do it, they did it, right? And I got so excited by that that I started doing other cartoons. I started doing other drawings. And now at that time, I was brand new on Facebook. And so I had like 10 friends. And so I shared this cartoon and I went from like 10 to like 20 friends. And I started doing other cartoons on other topics, other issues. And all of a sudden I went from like 20 friends to 50 friends. And I began to get teachers who said, wait a minute, your cartoons are helping us initiate conversations with some of our students that we haven't been able to initiate before. And I went from having 50 friends to having 100, having 200, having 300. That dialogue that I had wanted to initiate with my academic work, I was able to initiate with my illustrations. I had always thought that it was going to be my academic work, that densely written, highly researched, highly jargoned writing that was going to do the trick. It wasn't that actually created the audience. It was the illustrations that did it. So what is it that the illustrations did? I think that the main reasons the cartoons hit the nerve, where the essays could not hit the nerve, well, as the saying goes, a picture's worth 1,000 words. I think at the same time, more students today are getting accustomed to consuming visual text. People are now, using more Snapchat, Facebook, you name it, all these programs that people are using today, where they're growing literacy skills for digesting images, ideas via images. It also did not take me long to understand that my cartoon memoir was also affected because of its flexible narrative form. I did not have to assume a stuffy authorial voice to maintain my credibility. In my cartoon, the fourth narrative wall was pliable. I could as easily be an overeducated narrator as I could be a vulnerable first person witness to the same story without jarring the viewer. The curious thing is I had already learned this lesson on narrative many years before when I was in high school. And yet, because my assumption was so strong that the only way that I could tell my undocumented story in a way that was valid was if I did it in an overly academic point of view, I had not even considered cartoons as a serious tool of academic inquiry. All those years of academic training that I had received in graduate school had led me to believe that the only option I had for sharing my undocumented story was through dense textual analysis, and I should have known better. And here's why. In high school, I had a teacher, Miss Wolf, who thought that I had some academic potential. And so she nominated me for a scholarship. And it was a competition that had I known it, I would have said, no, I couldn't do it, because the competition was for me to go to Washington, D.C. And so she nominated me without knowing it. And so I had to go to, it was our city council that was going to send us. And I got a letter saying that I made the finalist list. When I told my dad that I had to go downtown to compete for this fellowship, my dad got incensed. He said, wait a minute, to go to Washington, D.C., you're going to get us all deported. You better not win the scholarship, because if you do that, you're going to get us all deported. And so I'm like, what am I going to do? My high school teacher already did this. She already did all this work. I mean, I'm supposed to be a good student. So what do I do? And yet my dad's saying, you can't be successful, because if you are, that means you risk in all of us. And so I figured, wait a minute, I think I know what I'm going to do. When I go to this competition, when I go to compete with these other students. I'm going to sit on this panel, and whenever they ask me a question, I'm going to do what this guy did. I'm going to take the Cantinflas approach. And that is, whenever they ask me a question, I'm going to answer by speaking in gibberish. And that is by using a technique pioneered by that brilliant Mexican comic of sounding sophisticated and intelligent, but not really answering anything. I'm not going to say anything. Whatever they ask me, my answer is going to be a non-answer. It's just not going to say anything, but I'm going to sound smart. That's what I wanted to do, right? I was so dumb. I did not realize that what they were looking for was not necessarily the answer to the question. What they were looking for was diplomacy. Somebody who would not ruffle feathers. Somebody who sounded polite. I ended up losing something I wanted to win or winning something I wanted to lose. My dad was angry when we got the letter that said I was the #1 person going to Washington, D.C. He said, "You just got us deported." I didn't know what to do. My mom was so happy for me because I was going to be the first one in the family to get on an airplane. My dad said, "Yes, on an airplane back home to Mexico." And I'm like, what? We were terrified and happy at the same time. I didn't know what to do. So my dad, what he did in order to protect us, he said, well, I want you to mix in. So he took me to the local mall where he bought me a 3-piece black polyester pinstripe suit so I could blend in when I went to the most prestigious places in Washington, D.C. And I was scared. The program was so prestigious that they took us everywhere. They took us to the Smithsonian. They took us to the Capitol building, the White House, the Supreme Court. But one particular place that they took us to that scared me the most was the FBI building. In my mind, I thought that if I was going to be caught anywhere in Washington, it would surely be there, in the home of the best detectives on earth. I had not slept the night before. Here I was that day, an undocumented kid at the FBI, about to take my final tour of the program. I was sweating so profusely that I was shining. That's when I noticed it. People in the crowd were pointing at me. They were grinning as I moved. I tried to walk away from them, hiding behind groups in the crowd. But everywhere I walked, people still looked at me. Students, guards, men, women in suits and briefcases, all staring at me, all of them smirking, smiling. I thought of my father's words, that his worst fears had come true, and that I had finally been found out. They all knew and now enjoyed watching me suffer. And just as I was, excuse me, and just as I was about to go through the metal detectors, there were new metal detectors because Reagan had just been shot. Just as I was about to enter the vastness of the FBI headquarters, the kid who was my roommate at our hotel walked up to me with a smile on his face. He leaned over. I almost wanted to beat him to the punch and to tell him, yes, I was undocumented and that I had it. I just wanted to be sent home. He leaned close to my ear and told me that my pants zipper had been unzipped for most of the day. And because I was wearing a black polyester pinstripe suit, it revealed my white Fruit of the Looms like neon. I tried to pull my zipper up so fast that I actually broke it. But I did not care. The boy had said nothing about me being undocumented. I felt relieved. I realized in that moment that that fear I had about me being undocumented, that fear I had about being caught and deported, it lived in my mind. What other things had I not permitted myself to do because of my need to feel safe? What other opportunities had I already turned down because of all the threats that I perceived? I realized in that moment that I had a unique perspective to share. As you can see, cartooning has allowed me to share these existential fears effectively. This is the reason why I created Diary of a Reluctant Dreamer. And yet there's only so much a little book can do. The xenophobic program that is now aiming to persecute undocumented immigrants in the US is too real, not just a byproduct of worried imaginations. This program, however, is not just aimed at undocumented immigrants. The attack on the undocumented immigrants is just but the most obvious aspect of what seems to be a larger policy that has taken aim at the heart of what used to be American progressive democracy, the social infrastructure that, as a result of the labor organizing and social activism of the 30s and 60s, increased access to education, healthcare, and legal protections for all working class and poor people. My belief is that working class and poor people of all ethnic backgrounds now need each other more than ever, and that we cannot let false debates based on false moralisms distract us from our common humanity. To view undocumented immigrant experience in the US as a totally unredeemable experience that needs to be excised without mercy is to buy into a false equivalency that has already stopped us from discerning what is lawful versus what is just. This is the reason why I have chosen to confront my fears about what it meant for me to be undocumented, because I cannot ask that people show empathy for undocumented community unless I first show empathy for the totality of my own experience. And that is why, in spite of my fears, I will continue to illustrate my undocumented American life in order to honor all those people in my life who gave me reason for hope, my parents, my community, and my teachers. Thank you.
Oh, let me catch my breath first. Alberto, por favor. Oh my God. Okay. I decided to laugh because it's so important. And I think that maybe those of us that have been illegal, that have been deported, that have experiences with the alphabet that you include in your book, we laugh about it. And you know, it's tragic, and it's tragic comedy, because like most of the entire time that you were talking, I was killing myself laughing, because like almost by the book. And I think that when your book came out, I was like, it was like you putting into drawings everything that I couldn't. And it's like, who the fuck is this guy? Why is he inside my brain? What is happening right now? And I was just so excited. And I didn't know who you were. And that is to show also to everyone that is listening to that this is how we end up building bibliography that is not canonical. Because before you joined us, I was telling them that my daughter we always play this game when we go camping, and she always says to me, okay, mom, like if you were to go to a deserted island, like what books would you take? And your book will be one of them.
Thank you.
And I'm not telling you because I'm kissing ass. I'm like telling you because that's literally like, that's what it is. Like, And I think it's because if I haven't shown it to my mom yet, because I don't think that I'm ready to have those conversations with my mom or my brother yet about like what we went through.
I totally understand.
It's a taboo, you know, like when you talk about like sin papeles is it's like a shame. It's like having a tattoo on your face. And when as soon as you said that you like the fear that you had walking into the FBI, my hands literally started sweating.
Mhm.
I was like, oh. And I still experience that every time I go to the airport.
Yeah.
And I know that's never going to go away. And believe it or not, when I finished teaching in a study abroad human rights program, I was teaching at the University of Michigan, and then Trump happened. And because it's an Ann Arbor, it's like a 10-hour bus drive from here to Toronto. And I rented an apartment there, and crossing that border every single time. And then Trump happened, and they were paying me a lot of money. And I was like, fuck this, I can't do this. Like, I'm going to die of cancer with this stress. Because when Trump happened, a lot of the buses that were crossing in the Detroit border were people from Syria, were people from Haiti, were people from Ecuador, were people from Guatemala, El Salvador, Mexico, and I was among them, right? So evidently I'm not white. So it was like, kind of like the Border Patrol emptying the buses, and me was the only person of color making it through.
Wow.
And I said to my husband, I'm like, I can't do it. Like, even despite everything that I have been through in my life, I still couldn't do it. I can't do it. Oof. Man, where's my husband with my beer? Okay, so I'm
happy to take questions. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I wanna open up the floor, because we have here in this crowd educators, community leaders, faculty, not only from Turtle Island but from all over the world. So I know that they want to jump in. So please go ahead. Or reactions. I know that there is. Let's give them a minute or two to think about. Okay, Vicky. Go ahead, Vicky.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you so much. So I actually live in Dallas, Texas. And actually just yesterday was the last day that I worked at the shelter for the unaccompanied minors. There was a shelter with 2,000 young men. And thankfully, they closed it down because I saw a news clipping that QAnon is coming to Dallas the end of May. And I said, y'all, security is a joke. And they said, please don't talk about this. I'm like, no, I'm going to talk about it because you're putting So really, this is my question. Okay, first of all, I do admit I live in Texas, and I know for everybody on this call, they're like, why would a human being willingly live in a place like Texas? And I get that, but I have to say that there are women like Ann Richards and Barbara Jordan and Molly Ivins, who said, the only Bush I trust is my own, back when Bush was running for president. So my question is, even as I drive around Dallas, what do I see? I see Trump 2024 signs. And my stomach gets in knots. And so I'm really wondering, because I want to write about this. They were like, no photographs, right? But I want to write about this because I was like that fly on the wall, right? I got to see so much during those 3 months that I was at that shelter. I don't want it in an academic journal, right? I feel like writing a letter, dear Jill and Kamala, right? But it's that same question you have, like, where is the impact? Because it was actually an example of good government at work. It was actually an example, public health officials were there checking on it was run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement Services, right? And I got to because I just act dumb, right? I would just act real dumb, like, oh, who are you? And where do you work? I learned so much just like being that fly on the wall. And I feel like that's an important something to tell. And it broke my heart when these young boys showed up, because I helped them call their loved ones or relatives. That was how I volunteered. And they'd show up with just a little piece of paper, right? And they'd show up and we'd try calling. The numbers didn't work.
Wow.
The tears would start. Or they'd say, they took my belongings at the border.
Yeah.
And my numbers were all in my bag. I was like, man, why didn't you freaking memorize these numbers, right? Because it was only the numbers that would save their lives under these circumstances. But it's like, I've got all this in me now. And I want to know, because I've started the writing about it, but I don't know, like, it's that same question you have, like, can I do academic writing? Yes. Do I want to do it? I'm like, I think I just got to witness something. Who were the other volunteers? A woman proudly tell, oh, my parents got degrees in Mexico. My dad was an engineer. My mom was a social worker, and I grew up on the border. And I was like, did you ever hear of Carmelita Torres? Right? Did you ever hear the gas bath riots? She's like, no. I said, oh, just Google it, right? How do you think the Nazis learned about, fumigating people? They learned it from the Americans. So here, I don't know what to do with these stories that are just like marinating inside of me right now. So that's really my question for advice. Yeah.
Yeah, Vicky, and I think you're asking a question that is maybe larger than I think it's a question for all of us. And it's certainly a question that I grapple with, because I think it's the ethical question of our time, and that's the question about our own kind of, what's the line in the sand around our own complicity and our own agency in what we allow, and what we how we our own activism, how we trigger our own activism, right? And that I think that one of the things that has been weaponized is indifference and really, a lack of caring in terms of the humanity of others. And for me, my goal, and this is part of the professional work that I do, is not so much to try to score political points, but rather to create as much bridges around our own shared humanity as possible. Because I think that I don't care who wins or who loses. What I want to know is the cost around our own humanity in terms of, the decisions that we're making. And we're making some really dire decisions right now. And that one of the things that I think about that gives me hope, and I do have hope. In California, not so many years ago, for those of us who are undocumented, was in a similar place around Proposition 187, when a lot of us were very worried about how draconian things were becoming in California for the immigrant population here, and how, it seemed that we were being legislated out of existence when Pete Wilson was running the state. And one of the things that happened was that um, there was a critical mass, not just of immigrants, and immigrants got organized. Immigrants, kind of came together, and those of us who could, uh, that's how my parents, that's how my family, myself, my wife, we became citizens. We saw the urgency in that action. We did it. But there were allies, who also came together. And within not many years, California went from being one of the most anti-immigrant states in the union to probably being the most pro-immigrant states in the union, because there was a transformation. And I think we're in that fork in the road right now, nationally. And in particular, if you look at young people can see the future. I think young people can see the future. And what you're seeing at universities, the racial reckoning that happened after COVID, and particularly after the murder of George Floyd, is that people understood that the legacy of racism in the U.S. Was one that continues to persist, and that we have to respond to it in meaningful ways, and we can't ignore it, and that these things are interrelated, right? And so I think that for me, where I have hope. So on the question of undocumented immigrant policy and situations today, there's a generation of undocumented immigrant students who have been making it through undergraduate programs to graduate school, who are getting into graduate programs, who are now becoming faculty. And you're going to be seeing an emergence of undocumented immigrant studies as a field. And I think soon this is going to affect the way that we frame that experience in a way that we're going to get a little bit more complexity. And so rather than kind of having this divide and conquer strategy that gets used over and over and over again in a very Machiavellian way by the Republicans, is going to complicate that a little bit. And I see that happening more and more as demographically, as our society changes. That's why the Republicans are doing what they're doing right now, because they're trying to maintain the apartheid that they currently have as much as possible. That's my response.
Thank you, Vicky, for your question, and Alberto for your answer. Gloria, go ahead with your question, please.
Hi, so I have sort of a parallel story to yours. 6 years ago, I tried moving to Oakland in California, and I tried to do it legally. So this was me recently graduated from my PhD program in Monterey. And I heard that they had a shortage of teachers in Oakland, and that they had undocumented children that were alone with no adults arriving like all over the Bay. And I said, okay, I want to do it. I want to migrate legally. So I had my papers, I had my passport, and because I'm from the border, I had a border crossing card, which it is also like a B1, B2, and supposedly that allows me to give like short lectures, but not be employed. So I was ready. My grandma died, and with my inheritance money, I paid for like my plane to Oakland and a month of rent. So I went there, and I was doing exactly what the instructions to migrate legally said. Like, you first have to go have a B1, B2 visa, and like go and have your interviews and get a job, and then the job has to file some paper for you. So I did all that legally, like according to what was in the website. I go to customs in San Francisco. I do my appointment, and I have like my interview, and I said, okay, I have all this. I want to stay legally. What do I have to do? They didn't know how to do it.
Wow.
There is no way to do it legally. There's no pathway to do it legally. You have to do it illegally and then regularize yourself. There is no way to do it like as it should. And that was before Trump. Then Trump came, and I had to return to Monterrey because I ran out of time and my permit to legally be there. But I was discouraged. Like, I don't know what would the way be to do things the right way. It seems like there's are systems in place to force you to do everything illegally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that like your impression, your experience with this?
Yeah. I mean, there's been a lot of analysis that I think will concur with that. You know, the rhetorical point about doing it the right way. You know, and you get this argument, particularly from conservatives, about you got to get to the back of the line. You know, if you're going to do it the right way, you got to follow the process. There is no process. There is, and so that's the disingenuous part of the whole thing. That the system is broken, and that's the nature of the kind of the lack of ethics in all of that. That the whole process is basically highly unethical in that if you have money and if you're coming from specific countries, that you're able to gain status pretty quickly. But if you're coming, on the basis, let's say, of an economic appeal, or from, if you're coming from Central America, for example, or if you're coming from Mexico generally, that is nearly impossible, to enter the country following proper procedure. And so you end up, getting into an undocumented pathway, and that then, becomes a point where it just reinscribes a very prohibitive, process itself. And that's the reason why, needing to have reform, becomes so important. And yet, whenever reform comes up for discussion, because reform connotes or kind of often represents for in Washington, the way people interpret it is in the future representing voters, right? That these are going to be communities that will produce voters. There's a management of the population that is also happening, right? And so, that I think we're in a moment where it's very tenuous, and I think my sense is that the real veto for all of this is business. That business is the entity that has to decide what's in its best interest, because capitalism itself depends on having markets, and particularly internal markets. And I think that the population is getting so destabilized currently with the kind of ethnic antagonism that is being promoted, that I'm not sure you're going to have any kind of equilibrium if you keep, promoting this antagonism. And particularly, if you look at industries like the meat packing industry, if you look at farm working, if you look, there's a lot of industries that are precarious because their labor pools are, suffering. And a lot of it is also they've relied on disposable pools of labor. They relied on immigrant populations, and so that's one of the issues I think that we have to resolve. But it's a large, I mean, again, you have these competing ethical questions in the U.S. And it's not just the U.S. This is a global question. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I see the the comments in the chat. Absolutely. This is a brilliant crowd here. Yeah.
I think Maria has her hand up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that amazing presentation, Alberto. While you were narrating and storytelling, I kept thinking of Jaime Escalante. Have you heard of him?
Oh,
and
yeah.
I saw you as his student, and I saw you as inspiring. You're probably as inspiring as he was. And for those who don't know Jaime Escalante, I'll put his name on the chat. And I want you to tell us, what do you feel, what do you think when I name Jaime Escalante?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I've had teachers who have been very influential. I mean, I know the movie Stand and Deliver, and so that's how I know Jaime. And I've known some of Jaime's students. I used to teach at Cal State Northridge, and so some of the students from Garfield High would go up to Northridge, eventually as students there, and Jaime, of course, was mythical, right? As someone who was, very charismatic as a teacher, and I think that's the issue. I think that for me, Freirean teaching, somebody who teaches from a Freirean perspective, where you are attentive to your students and you care about their stories and you care about them individually, and you want to you use storytelling as a technique, not so much because you want to seduce them in terms of the story that you want to tell, but because you know that they have a story and you want them to tell their own story. You want them to claim their own voice. That's the whole point of it. And for me, the reason that I do my work, I struggled so many years with silence that when I came into voice, I wanted to share that process with others. And so my own, kind of epiphany around, the words that I learned to name my own experience, I wanted to share with other students, and I wanted to hear what they had to share. And that's also where the cartooning came from. In fact, there were a lot of things that initially I didn't even know how to name because it was so painful and there was really no language to it. So the only thing that I could do was to draw it. Like there were some things that my parents didn't want to talk about, but they would laugh with me when I would draw a situation, even though I would not name. Here's what happened. But tell me about that moment, right? What does it mean to you, right? I could draw certain situations and then they would give it language, especially with my mom. She's somebody whose story matters a great deal to me. And my mom is someone who today, she suffers from diabetes. She suffers from a lot of body aches. And one of the things that I came to understand, because I think that we always miss this, is that the genesis of a lot of her pains was actually the down payment on my success. That a lot of the pains that she has today, her diabetes, her body pains, she got because of the border crossing that she went through, because of the sacrifices that she lived during those first years in the U.S., because of how she wanted to raise us, and all of that. And so as I listened to her story, often stuff that she didn't want to really tell, I began to appreciate that. And then as I learned that, I started talking to my students, and I saw that they had the same things. And so I would ask them, what kind of conversations have you had with your parents about this? And often they were like, well, I haven't had any conversations. And so, what kind of ethnographic tools could I give you so you could do your own ethnographic work with your parents, right? And so sometimes it would be, again, these telenovela work with cartoons that they would do themselves. And so I remember doing a workshop with undocumented students at Berkeley who would do their own, storytelling of how they came into consciousness about their own identities, or even naming the experience with their parents. And it was, magical work sometimes, because you will learn about all these things that sometimes, came through tears, but it was also liberatory for the families. But yeah, I really appreciate. I mean, I think that's what Jaime Escalante, for me, was, one, enthusiasm in teaching, teaching as a way of triggering liberation, and secondly, respecting always the lessons you can learn from your students.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much. Muchas gracias.
Sure.
I think, dime cuánto tiempo más puedes estar con nosotros para to monitor the time?
Maybe about 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, so I think Ali had her hand up, and then Robin. So Ali and Shireen. So Ali, Robin, and Shireen. So let's make it, let's go directly to questions so that everybody can get their questions in, please. Thank you.
So I was just wondering, kind of taking it all in a different direction. I just saw today that Nicole Hannah-Jones was denied tenure, the woman of the 1619 project, even though she won the Pulitzer for it. I know not too long ago, Roxanne Gay was denied sabbatical or time to go on her tour by MIT and ended up leaving MIT. So I was just wondering what kind of support you got from I mean, I understand that Berkeley is a bit more of a liberal, forward-thinking, but like, have there been any obstacles? What kind of support is there? Do you think you being in administration has made a change? Or, just kind of how have you navigated this river that really seems to be getting worse and worse, strangely enough?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think that the context of each of those situations is really important. And I think a lot of it has to do with, for example, the trustees, who at the end of the day are the ones who are sponsoring a lot of those decisions. I think some of the local universities and administrations might be voting one way, but the trustees are vetoing some of the local decisions. And so for my situation is a little different in that my promotion, my evaluation has nothing to do with what I do on the side. And so my creative work is entirely, I do it after I leave Berkeley. This is on the side, kind of, I happen to, not be able to sleep too much because I have a compulsion to draw at night. I do this as therapy, and so that I just, when I watch the news, rather than write an angry letter to the editor, or get on the Yahoo chat rooms to argue with somebody who I don't know who it is, I'm gonna do a cartoon. I'm gonna do something where I'm gonna try to direct my energy in that direction. And I've been a creative writer for a long time, and that's where I always wanted to be kind of the next great undocumented American novelist. That's really where it came from. But I was a failed undocumented immigrant novelist. And so when I had a friend of mine, I was lucky enough to be in Sandra Cisneros' Macondo Writers Program, and a friend of mine in that program said, "Well, actually, you're not a novelist. You're writing a biography. It's just you're too afraid to name it that." And so I'm like, yeah, I got caught. And so when that happened, I started doing work that I try to be a little more courageous in that direction. And so I'm moving slowly. The next work that I'm working on is Pedagogy of the Depressed: Life for Undocumented Immigrants under the Trump dictatorship. And so that's the work that I do. But I'm not trying to count it towards any kind of promotion at Berkeley, because I know that that's on the side. My work creatively and my work professionally have a very clear firewall between them. And that to me is very comfortable. And so that's the situations, in particular, I think in the arts and humanities, there's a lot of situations where that firewall is very, very pliable. And I think that the situation, in Carolina, the situation in other places in the East Coast, is one where unfortunately politics is weighing in too heavily into academic governance. And it's unfortunate because I think that universities are losing out, and we're right now in a place where there's a paradigmatic change happening in higher education, and it is precisely people like Roxane Gay and folks like those who we need for the next iteration of a higher education to flourish, and we're losing out on those opportunities.
Robin, you're next.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so what resonated with me was with those personal stories and identities. And my question is that, some cultural backgrounds have a stigma attached to certain things, right? They don't want to share those personal stories because they think there's a stigma if, they reveal certain things. What are your thoughts on that? And, I totally agree with personal stories. They're so impactful. The more people talk about those personal stories and those lived experiences, the more safer the community becomes. It provides them that outlet to speak about themselves, but it takes time as well, right? But again, I think a lot of folks are still, especially in the school settings, for example, a lot of folks still feel like they cannot express who they are because they're going to be, ridiculed, or they're not feeling safe, or they're going to just be, stereotyped as that person, so to speak. But yeah, for me, the more I share my personal stories, I find that, students and staff start to come out and want to have more deeper, meaningful conversations.
Thank you, Robin, for such a great question. I want to share one anecdote, I think, connected to that, because I did grapple with that question. Back when I was a very green behind the ears graduate student trying to begin actually my dissertation, I was lucky enough to be admitted into a dissertation writing program that took place in San Antonio, Texas. And because Sandra Cisneros actually had done one semester at UC Berkeley when she was working on some of her short stories. And I was lucky enough when she did that I had been her student at UC Berkeley. And she had been miserable at UC Berkeley. I didn't know that. But when I visited San Antonio and I had been her student, I had her contact information, and at that point, again, I was a graduate student. I said, hey, it would be great if we could, touch base. And I wanted to get some guidance from her, because I was working on some academic questions, but I was still doing creative writing, and I just wanted to, see, how she was doing. And so she actually invited me to go and have dinner. And, because I was in a dissertation writing program, we have been housed in a hotel that had great food, but it wasn't, after 5 days of eating exactly the same thing, I took her up. I'm like, man, that sounded great. Let's do that. And we went out, and man, did she take me out to have dinner. We went out. I don't know where she took me, but it was delicious. And then she took me out to drink. I don't drink that much, so it was great. And then I don't know where she took me, but we were partying everywhere. And then we were riding. She had this red pickup truck she went fast. I mean, it was great. And then we got back to the hotel, and it was really late at night, and I was supposed to be up really early the next morning for a presentation. And I think I might have had a little too much to drink, but I asked her the question I wanted to ask her, which was, I was wrestling, with this creative work that I wanted to do versus this academic work. But to me, the creative work was important, but I was worried because of this taboo question, because it was on undocumented immigrant identity. And I don't know if I could go there, because it was people didn't really want to talk about that, right? And she sat there and she said, you know, the most important thing to do is to write about the most visceral issue you care about, the, the stuff down there in your gut that you care about. And that's what's going to sustain you. And that's what people want to hear. That's what drives you. And even in your academic work, you'll find that that's what's at the heart of your academic work. And she said that, and even though, again, I think I might have had a little too much, and she said it, and I try to remember every word she said. I think I dreamt about it. I don't know. I mean, the next morning, it just resonated like forever. And it has resonated ever since then. And I remember when I was teaching, many years later, in one of her poems, it was a poem that's actually titled "From Down There," and it was all about the taboo, and it was almost the same exact conversation, and it just it felt that she was speaking to me again, and to me that about confronting your fears, it was about kind of really the authentic self-amnesty around your identity of that which needs to be named. And to me, that is what I try to do, and to model for my students, because, especially as I have gone up in my trajectory as a scholar and as a student, each step as I gone up, I have felt a sense of responsibility to name these things in order to give support to those who come behind me, just like she did for me. And to me, the more I've done it, the more I have normalized it for others. When I first did it, I remember writing one of the first essays around embracing my identity as an ex-undocumented immigrant person. It's in my book. It was one of the first essays written out there, around that identity. Next thing you know, everybody was doing it, and it became not a big deal. But for me, when I first did it, it was almost like psychologically, it was hard to do, but you have to do it, so anyways, that's my response.
Thank you. And then we'll take one more questions. Shireen, you're there?
I am here, yes. And good evening, Alberto. Thank you for sharing your
Shireen.
Life, your stories, your pictures, your drawings. And actually, my question is quite tied to Robin's question. And I've been asked to do a little bit of work with a nonprofit program here in Toronto that is looking to do some, the way they put it, social justice work about the stories of undocumented students here in Canada, well, specifically in Ontario. So your work really speaks to this relevant experience that I'm having right now. And I guess my question is about people that may be outside of these experiences and communities doing this work and sharing in these stories, or wanting to tell the stories, maybe with the best of intentions, whether it's scholarly work, social justice, or advocacy, for whatever their purpose is. I just want to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that allyship is important. And I think that the first rule of allyship is almost like, Star Trek's, rule, the prime directive, first do no harm. That's I think listening, to the experience of folks and taking cues, welcoming undocumented folks where they're at, and taking your cues from them in terms of how they want to be supported, and advocating from them, giving your own agency in terms of what you can control. That's usually the best way to go. But often, the one thing that I've always been mindful of is that the key thing that undocumented folks have is their voices. And the one thing that I don't want to do is sacrifice their voices or appropriate their voices without them being in control of their voices. And so they need to be the agents of their own experience. And that for me, I always want to give them that. Now, once they become the agents of their own experience, they gain power that they don't know they have. And often, you see this revolutionary change in that power, and they become amazing, amazing people. I always tell the story of Cantinflas, and for me, Cantinflas is this amazing person. How Cantinflas became Cantinflas, and again, I'm gonna maybe end with this story, because Cantinflas, became this, he's one of the most important cultural figures in Mexican arts. He is a comic who, in the early 1900s, had been a vaudevillian actor. He had begun as a boxer, but had been a terrible, terrible boxer who kept getting knocked out. So he had to change profession. And so he became a vaudevillian actor. And so he started going, for some of his first, performances. And in one of his key performances, he went up and he tried to do his routine, but he forgot his lines. And so I don't know if you've ever had that dream where, you go up for a big performance and you forget your lines. What I would do is I would run away, because I have that dream all the time, right? But what he did is that he forgot his lines, and rather than run away, he improvised. He thought of a new shtick. He started mimicking the elite in Mexico, kind of creating this new language. He actually discovered a routine that became his calling card, became the thing that he was known for. And he became famous for it. And he perfected it over time and became one of the world's foremost comics because of it. And I always shared that with a lot of undocumented students, because it was at the moment of stress that Cantinflas became who he really was. And a lot of undocumented students, they've experienced stress all the time. They have skills. And often when you put them on stage at the moment of stress, they become who they really are. That's what I want to leave you with.
That was a beautiful way of wrapping up the conversation in terms of centering voices, because we are at the midpoint in the semester, and I think that it should be already pretty self-explanatory that you cannot speak on our behalf. And if you do, there's people like me now that if they did, like if my mom, for example, did not stop people when they were stealing her voice, she taught me well. And now that she had me, now I am that generation that will stop you. Like we will literally stop you. I think that is the generation nowadays is like hashtag silence no more, and it ends with us. So now I think that with what you were saying about this notion of like empowerment, I think that pretty much illustrates the work that you're doing. And your book should be an obligatory reading in high school, in university, in educational spaces, for linguistics, for border patrols, for people working in immigration. So I'm gonna continue sharing it because it's political work, Alberto. And I'm very thankful that you did that. I don't think that you maybe had that not like original intention, but like now we are discussing it here, and hopefully we'll be able to like multiply your message elsewhere. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Clelia. Thank you, everyone,
for joining us, and I'll see you in the battle. Te veo en las, I see you in the trenches.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye. Woo! Okay, so, wow. Okay, so what are we doing now? So it's 7:30. Take a 10-minute break to stretch and to sort of like, yeah, okay, we'll do that. And then we'll see you back in 10 minutes. Okay.
Play some music, Clelia.
Sorry, what?
Play some music.
Oh yeah, no. Oh yeah, I was gonna.
You always choose a good soundtrack.
Oh, I know. Oh, you have no idea the one that I have for you today. It just came out of the oven.
I think that's part of your syllabus too. is your soundtrack for
Can you,
sure.
yeah, no, my syllabus is a monster if you were to see
Well,
what.
you know.
You know how we do. Okay, I should stop recording.